Hey everyone, welcome back to Portal of Wisdom. I'm back today with another story for you. So if you are new to the channel, like and subscribe and click that little post notification bell so you get alerted when I post new videos. And now on to today's topic. Today's topic is going to be another lost gold story in Arizona. And this story is titled Sanders Lost Gold. In the late 1870s, Arizona was still a pretty wild place. And due to the wilderness of the place and the wildness and the fact that very few towns or people were here, but people were starting to come to this territory, the government did set up a few forts and built them around the Arizona and New Mexico areas. And these spots were meant, or these forts were meant to help protect the citizenry that was coming into this wild land. And one of these forts was Fort Apache near present-day White River, Arizona. So these forts would send out patrols to check the surrounding hills and mountains for hostile Native Americans that may threaten the prospectors, the farmers and ranchers in the valleys, and other citizens who made their homes here or were just passing through on their way to California or other places. Fort Apache regularly sent out armed patrols that were on horseback, and these patrols would commonly head south or west and would patrol the valleys of the Rio Salado River and its many tributary creeks like Tonto Creek and various other creeks, and they would search for Apaches that may be in that area. The Apaches were the tribe that were most often looked at due to their general hostile nature towards a lot of the settlers and ranchers and prospectors. So they were seen as the main cause of the Native American skirmishes in the area. So some of the other tribes in the area tended to be a lot more friendly, and they were generally not concentrated on and looked for like the Apaches were during these patrols. One of these patrols headed west into the Sierra Ancha Mountains. So this area is near the small village of Young, Arizona today. And this area is still extremely remote and rugged and very difficult to travel within. And even today, there is little to no population in this area. So the town of Young, Arizona sits on Road 288 in the Sierra Ancha Wilderness area. And this area is, or I guess this road kind of bisects or cuts through this monstrous wilderness area. And I've camped before here on Workman Creek, which is off of the 288 and, near a tall waterfall, which is very beautiful. But this area, like I said, is still very remote. And if it weren't for Road 288 that cuts through and Young, Arizona sits on this road, this area would probably still be nearly untouched by civilization today. Now, there are some points of interest that people do make their way into to explore in this big wilderness area, like the Salome Jug, and there's some cliff dwellings and Native American rock art locations here. But beyond these few locations, the bulk of this wilderness is still untouched today. So anyway, we're getting a little bit off topic here, but you get the picture of the remoteness of the area. So one of these patrols that was sent out, there was a man and his last name was Sanders. We don't know his first name, and it wasn't mentioned, and it's probably because a lot of the military men referred to themselves by their last name. I mean, they still do quite a bit today. So Sanders was this man's name, and that's what history has it recorded as. We don't know his first name. But on this particular patrol, there was said to be a dozen men on horseback, so they were Army cavalry. They were on patrol along the Salt River, and the Salt River is the English name for Rio Salado, which is the Spanish name for Salt River. And still in Arizona today, those two names are interchangeable. Some people still call the river Rio Salado, and some call it the Salt River. And in Tempe, Arizona, right alongside of the river, the main road that follows this river is even called Rio Salado today. So the names, like I said, are pretty interchangeable, and so you may hear it called one name or another, and it's the same river. So as Sanders and his patrol were patrolling along the Salt River, they heard gunfire and they saw some smoke in the distance. And they knew that the direction they heard the gunfire and saw the smoke come from was in a direction of a smaller ranch that they were familiar with. And this ranch was owned by some settlers. And by the time Sanders and the rest of the patrol were able to make it to this ranch, they found all of the buildings and the house ablaze, and the whole family was recently deceased. So it appeared to be an Apache raid. Apparently there were arrows and other evidence of the Apache, plus the Apache stole the cattle from the ranch and they were herding them north across the Salt River. So the cavalry were able to follow these tracks, the cattle tracks in the dirt, and they followed them and tracked down the raiding party. This was, of course, most likely due to the fact that the cavalry were able to go faster on their horses than the Apache party that could only go as fast as the cattle that they were herding north. So when the cavalry caught up with the Apaches scattered in different directions. So this caused the cavalry party to also have to split up and chase the Apaches in different directions. Sanders inadvertently ended up by himself chasing after two Apache warriors. Later, Sanders had said that he had chased these two warriors 2 miles west along the Salt River, and then he headed north up a very tight, narrow creek with steep sides. So it was around this point that he lost visual on the Apache. So he wasn't sure how he lost them, but he continued up the creek for several more miles with no luck. He eventually reached a narrow spot on the creek where he had to get off of his horse and he had to climb up a waterfall. We don't know exactly how tall this waterfall was. So he climbs up this waterfall, and once he gets to the top of the waterfall and climbed a little more by the ridge line, he couldn't believe his eyes. So when he looked around on the ground, he found some beautiful pieces of quartz laced with gold. And he found quite a few specimens of this gold-laced quartz all around him. So he determined that this gold-laced quartz had to be coming from higher up on the hillside or the cliffside. So he climbed up to have a better look. And as he got up this hillside, he found a quartz outcropping on the side of the hill or the side of the cliff. We don't really know how steep it was, but at this point he said that he found a vein of quartz on the side of the hill or the side of the cliff, and it was said to be 3 yards long and 8 inches wide. And he said this outcropping was laced with gold throughout the entire quartz vein. So at this point, Sanders knew he had a dilemma. He had 2 years left of service in the Army, and he knew he could not come back to this area and mine this gold until he was out of the service. He just wouldn't have enough time or leave to do so. So Sanders walked around this area very carefully. He tried to make mental note of all the landmarks and everything that he saw so that he could hopefully retrace his steps in 2 years when he was out of the Army. He also knew a lot of time had elapsed since he had split from the group, and he knew that he better be making his way back to the group of the other cavalry riders and join back up with them and let them know that he was okay and he had lost his two Apaches that he was chasing. So he made his way back to the rest of the patrol, but he said nothing of his secret at that point. From that day on, Sanders volunteered for every possible patrol that he could possibly join along the Salt River. He wanted to make sure that he could recognize this particular creek that turned north from the Salt River. He did not want to forget this location, and he wanted to try to come back to it as much as he could within this 2-year period before he got out of the Army. He wanted to make sure he could retrace his steps. So he felt his chances of remembering this creek were much better if he could at least pass by it periodically on patrols and continue to commit it to memory. And so that's what he did. So eventually Sanders was discharged from the Army, and he made his way to Phoenix for supplies, and he supplied himself very well and had provisions and mining equipment that would last him for up to a year in the rugged mountains. So during his last 2 years at Fort Apache, he had told 2 other men about his secret. Those 2 men had now been moved from Fort Apache to Fort McDowell, which was very close to Phoenix. So these 2 men happened to be getting done with their enlistment about 1 month after Sanders. So when Sanders was just discharged, he would be up in kind of northeast Arizona at Fort Apache, and Fort McDowell is more central, just to the east of Phoenix. So when Sanders was discharged, he was much further away at Fort Apache, and he needed to make his way all the way down to Phoenix and supply himself and prepare and do a bunch of things to get ready for his trek into the mountains. So it seems at this point his 2 friends were nearly out of the military themselves, so Sanders waited for them to be discharged and join him on his journey. He likely also felt that there was more safety in numbers, as the mountains they were going to head into could be very hostile, especially with Apaches, and very dangerous and remote. So these 3 men could likely defend themselves better than one, and so this seems to be why Sanders decided to have his 2 friends join him. So when all these 3 men were all loaded up, and they were last seen at Fort McDowell at the Sutler store, and from here they headed south to the Salt River, and they were never seen or heard from again. Now, apparently, we know a few details about Sanders' discovery. Sanders couldn't manage to keep his secret to himself and told his 2 companions or army friends, who would then join him on the journey to look for the gold. It seems that one or maybe both of his friends had likely shared all of Sanders' story and details with at least another person or more, and those stories of Sanders' discovery have made it through the years, and that is why we know about Sanders' discovery. But no one knew for sure if this tale was true or not. So that is, we didn't know for sure it was true until around 1900 or 1901, when some ranch hands were rounding up some cattle that had strayed some 10 miles or so from the ranch, and the ranch hands ended up on Coon Creek. As the ranch hands brought the cattle back down Coon Creek on their return to the ranch, they spotted a small rock cabin up on the hillside. And it was only halfway there, as about half of it had fallen in and sounded like it blended into the hillside fairly well. And it also appeared as they came upon it or kind of climbed up the hillside to it that there had been a pretty bad fire there many years before. So near the cabin, they found a bleached human skull near a bush, and then as the ranch hand looked a little closer, he found the rest of the skeleton there with tattered pieces of clothing hanging off of it. And as one of the other ranch hand friends looked around the other side of the cabin, he found two more skeletons, and one of these skeletons, it was said to still have 3 arrows protruding from it. So these ranch hands made makeshift graves and buried the 3 dead men. Then they explored the fallen cabin a bit, and one of the men yelled, "We've got gold here." And in the rubble, they had found a 3/4-inch wide gold nugget. And this nugget was nearly 2 inches long. So as they dug through the rubble some more, they noticed a carved rock that had a name engraved into it. It appeared that this rock had been carved with a sharp tool many years prior. The name that was carved onto the rock was Sanders. Not much more was mentioned about the ranch hands. We don't know if they extensively searched the rubble from the cabin or if they had to get back down to the creek and get the cattle back. So I would imagine once they found this large gold nugget that they did take a little bit of time to try to move rocks around and rifle through everything and see if they could find more gold. It's possible there could still be some more hidden gold at this location, or it's possible that the Apaches caught Sanders and his 2 friends fairly quickly, but maybe not too quickly because they did build a cabin. So it's hard to say, but there could be some gold up by the cabin on the hillside under a flagstone or something like that, but we may never know. There could also still be a very rich gold vein near a tight spot on a creek near a waterfall, and with this area being so remote that it's not really a stretch to think that it could still be out there and not discovered yet. I'm not suggesting that people go out in the remote, desolate mountains to look for this location. These mountains are still very dangerous. If you got lost out there, you could very easily die of dehydration or by rattlesnake bite and never make it out of these mountains. So anyhow, that is the story of Sanders' lost gold in the Sierra Ancha Wilderness area, some location in central Arizona. And that wilderness is extremely large, so it could be on any number of different tributaries that run into the Salt River. So thanks for listening.